Hi, my name is Bob Mason, and I want to welcome you to another MSN webinar. Tonight, we're privileged to have Doug Pollock with us. Doug is the author of an astounding book, a revolutionary book in my view, entitled God Space, where spiritual conversations occur naturally. So Doug, thank you for being here and welcome.
Well, thank you. I hope you can be saying thank you after we finish tonight.
Well, I tell you what, you take that jacket off and we might be a little bit further away.
I want to see if you guys could love the sinner, you know.
Oh, is that what it is? Yeah, I'm pretty neutral when it comes to Ohio State, but since you've got it on bright and prominent, I thought I'd push back on you a little bit.
All right.
So Doug, I remember sitting in a coliseum or an arena with 5,000, 6,000 other people in Colorado. I guess it's about 5 or 6 years ago, and just being blown away by some of the things that you were saying on stage. And I remember, I think either before I walked into that arena or shortly after, somebody shoved one of your books into my hands, and I was just really walked away having a lot to think about it, and have read it over and over and over since I got my copy of it and told other people about it. Why did you write that book?
Well, I think in all fairness, I failed my way into writing that book. That book really is a reflection of my failures, and I think I was raised to be a marketing rep for Jesus, and I often call myself now a recovering evangelist. And that book reflects my journey into recovery. And that much of what I had done, even though my heart was in the right place, I had good intentions, that much of what I had done to people, I look back and I think there were 3 evangelistic misdemeanors that I frequently committed. Number one, I think often I would hijack conversations because I had an agenda, and my goal was, of course, to get to my agenda. And so I learned how to hijack a conversation, take it over, and steer it where I wanted to go. The second misdemeanor that I committed quite frequently was I exceeded the speed limit. I had a destination. I want to get there in the conversation. And instead of realizing that everybody's on their own journey and everybody, in terms of their own interest or appetite, there's no way sometimes that would match where I wanted to go, but I wanted to get there fast. So sometimes I would just, and then often I'd have to say I ran the stop signs. People were giving me signs with their body and kind of looking at their watch, and I get, looking back, I'm going like, this person has checked out. And but like I said, I was kind of like a marketing rep in the sense that I often wonder if those guys get paid more if they get through a certain part of their spiel, because we have a little game we play actually here at our house. I will call, if they call during dinner, my family counts in the background, silently, of course, not to be rude, but how many times I will politely say, no, thanks. No, I'm not interested. No, not tonight. No, my family and I are having dinner right now. And 7, we've been up to 7 times before the person on the other end finally gets it and says, I guess they're not interested. Yeah. And in some ways I look back and I was that guy, and I was passionate for people to know Christ the way I did. And so the intentions of my heart were good, but those were 3, what I call evangelistic misdemeanors that I frequently trafficked in and just was unaware. So God Space really reflects a whole work that God had to do in me to move to a whole different place when it came to spiritual conversations.
Wow. Well, thanks for your honesty in sharing that. Tell us, I mean, the book is entitled God Space. You've used that term several times just in the first few minutes of our webinar. What do you mean when you say God Space?
Well, God space, first of all, has to be created in us before we have the potential to create it for others. And when you look at Romans 12, I get this idea that we're supposed to offer our bodies to God as a living sacrifice. Well, I'm kind of a real practical theologian. I'm like, what does that look like? And I start thinking about, well, what does it look like for me to offer my eyes, my ears, my hands, my mind, my body? That composes what my body's all about. And as I begin to think about that, practically speaking, when I can be for another what God, through the power of his Holy Spirit, is to me, that is when God's space is created. So, like, when I move towards God, I mean, he wants me to know that he loves me and that it's safe for me to bring my real self out into the light and just as I am and meet him right where I am. And so in the same way, when God's space is created, cynics, skeptics, scoffers, whoever they are, wherever they're at in their journey, feel like it's a place where they can be themselves and represent who they are without, with the Christian suspending judgment and just being present with them in the conversation. And I think when we're able to do that, we create the space where God can work. Because now what we're really doing, and this is one of the big shifts for me, is now what we're doing is we're joining the conversation that God has already been having with them before we showed up. And that's a whole different kind of deal than me trying to have a conversation and steer it where I want it to go because I think I already know where it needs to go. And in reality, we're told in the Bible to keep in step with the Spirit. So in my mind, what does that look like when we're in a conversation with another?
Wow. Now, you seem to be hesitant about talking too much. And a lot of people in our audience are healthcare professionals. These are very capable, skilled individuals who've gone to school a long time to learn things to say. And so it's almost like they get paid to talk. Yet in your book, you talk about maybe we shouldn't talk so much. Unpack that a little bit and maybe keep in mind some of the people that are in our audience tonight.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'd raise the question, what's your IQ? And I'm not talking about in terms of your cerebral so much that way, but your influence quotient. I think there's a real belief in Christendom that we influence people. The only way we influence people is through talking and telling and giving answers. And it's a fun thing when someone pulls up beside you and says something like, hey, how can I know Jesus like you do? But let's be honest with one another. If your world's like my world,
I don't have that happen to me too much.
Absolutely. And my thought is if people aren't ready for the answers you'd like to give them and you'd like to tell them, maybe it'd be wiser to start off by listening, for heaven's sake, to where they're at to hear their story and to spend more time maybe asking questions, because my belief is that, in fact, I'm working on a new book and I think the focus is going to be how do we listen people into the kingdom. Now, the stat for those of you, and I'm not sure exactly where this comes from. I've seen it several times that the average doctor listens 37 seconds before making up their mind in terms of what the problem is. And anybody in the healthcare profession knows every year the wrong leg is cut off, the wrong breast is taken, the wrong arm is cut off because somebody believed they either made a snap judgment or didn't listen to what was going on. And as a result, something horrendous happened in the operating room. And I think often, if you think about the number of people today who've been hurt by church and who are leaving the church, who are saying no thanks to what we offer on Sunday morning, I believe that a lot of those people find themselves there because somebody stepped in their life and tried to give them an answer to a question maybe they weren't asking, or a solution that they weren't looking for. They weren't really listened to, and somebody just, if you want to say, proverbially cut off the wrong leg or the wrong arm, and they were wounded as a result of that. So listening, in fact, when people push me to say, well, where did your recovery start? My recovery literally started when I realized what a poor listener I was. And I realized I was a lot like a lawyer. I listened more with the intent, not to understand the person, but my intent was to reply, and kind of, I was looking at it as, how can I show them that they're wrong and I'm right? So already I was set up for a us versus them showdown. And what happens in one of those, even though some of the stuff I was sharing could have been spot on, the attitude I was communicating by not listening is, hey, I'm superior to you. You need to listen to me. Now, I would think, and I might be stepping out here, I'm not trying to offend anybody. I don't know any of you guys that might be listening in, but you've spent a lot of time in school. You've prepared in terms of the profession you're going into. I think sometimes the more we've done that, the more we feel compelled to be tellers, because that's kind of what we're paid to do. People expect to get answers when they're in our presence. And yet, many times, I think sometimes in the spiritual world, the answer is many times rejected because the person feels disrespected and feels like the Christian has been rude because the Christian hasn't done any listening.
Yeah.
And
in your book, in terms of drawing people out, you describe something called a wondering question. And I'm hearing you talk about listening. And so what is a wondering question, and how does that sort of come into play as you're listening?
Well, I guess, Bob, what I'm wondering right now is, why is that question so important to you? I say that because I think the beauty of wondering is it's organic. We all come into this world with a sense of wonder and a sense of curiosity. There's a stat I just saw just recently that the average 5-year-old asks 330 questions a day. If you've lost your sense of wonder, get around a 5-year-old sometime. But the beauty of wondering is that we all wonder. And if while we're listening to someone, we're hearing something, what I typically will do is capture a phrase of something that I've heard, and then I will reflect back, hey, as I've been listening to you, here's what I'm wondering. And wondering is a very non-threatening kind of thing. It's actually a very, I think something really cool happens when we wonder, because if it's genuine and it's authentic, what it does is it keeps the conversation going, or in many cases, it's the question that jumpstarts the spiritual conversation.
Could you give us an example or of that from like your own experience or somebody else's?
Oh, goodness, yeah. Yeah, let me share a story that you wouldn't have seen it or read about in the book. uh, there's really powerful story of I was flying to Canada to speak up there at Church of 2500 in Edmonton. And when I get on an airplane, a lot of times for me, an airplane is like a pseudo man cave. It's kind of a place where, I'm kind of nestled into my seat and I've got my computer and I'm thinking about where I'm going to speak next and what I'm going to do. And so I kind of crawl into that, and I relish those times because I need those times in terms of what I do. Well, I had a row all to myself, and that was really special. And I thought, this is going to be great. But right before the door closed, this lady comes running down the jetway and just gets on right before the door closes. And when you know it, she sits right next to me. She sits down, and they say the average woman needs 25,000 words a day. This lady was a flaming extrovert. She probably needed at least 40,000 words a day, and it was early in the morning, and she hadn't started yet. So when she sat down, it's just like a machine gun. It was like ba 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 ba. And she just started to hammer me with, and I'm sitting there. I already got my laptop out, and I'm like already wrestling with God. I'm God, like, no, God, not now. I really don't want to be on duty right now. I'm speaking tonight, 2,500 people. I need to prepare. And I'm going to take some time out as I tell the story because I don't want anybody to miss the obvious. If you wait until you feel like it, you'll miss so many opportunities, because I think when Jesus said you have to lose your life to find it, in a very real sense, in having spiritual conversations, you have to lose your life to find it. You might not feel like it. You just have to, by faith, say, God, you know what? I'm going to be faithful in this moment, because this could be a very much a divine appointment, and I don't want to miss it because I've got my agenda for my life. So I close my laptop because I wrestle with God enough, and I realize it's just always better just to tap out and go with what He's got. So I'm sitting there and we're talking, and the secret in a conversation, I think, to being interesting is to be interested. I think often Christians want to kind of find the thing they're interested in, that they want to talk about their worldview. But I find keeping the spotlight on others is so important. And Philippians 2:3 says, we should consider others better than ourselves in humility. And I think one of the best ways to do that in a conversation is to just, if you want to say it, shut up and listen to somebody else. So as I began to listen to her, I soon found out that she was a world traveler. She'd been to like 25 different countries. And so my curiosity, my sense of wonder began to bubble or began to percolate. I said, well, I'm just wondering, what takes you to all these places? Now, that was very authentic. There was no agenda there. I was just wondering. She said, oh, I'm a lead singer in a band. I said, whoa, that is very, very cool. Like, tell me about your, most exciting gig. She said, well, one time I was actually led on, I had a wireless saxophone and I was playing it on the back of a camel as I was led on the stage as my band played in front of the pyramids. I said, that is radical. That is so cool. I said, well, if you've had, experiences like that, tell me about your second most important gig and second biggest gig. And she said, oh, I once had a chance to play for President Bush. I'm going, that is neat. Like, what was that like for you? And she said, she said, I will never do that again. That was her tone of voice.
Wow.
And here's another one, I just sat there. So I often say, if you're listening well, at some point, you ought to hear something that ought to cause you to wonder. And in that situation, I stopped and I said, you've got me scratching my head over here. I said, most artists, I think, would want to play in front of like as many presents as possible, because I'll bet it came along with a pretty good paycheck. And she goes, oh, yeah. I said, so what gives? Like, why was this such a turnoff to play for President Bush? Now, let me give you a little context. This was right before the last election, And you know where we're at right now and how crazy things are. This was 4 years ago. And it was, at the time, she said, I am so sick. This was in October. She said, I'm so sick and tired of all of the rhetoric and all the back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. It just makes me sick, and I want nothing to do with politics anymore. And I said, you and I have a lot in common. Not only have we traveled the world, and previously we talked about all the different places we traveled and all the favorite foods and all that. I said, but I totally get what you're saying. I just don't understand why people in our culture can't have conversations with convicted civility. She goes, oh my gosh, yes, that's so true. I said, I haven't, I didn't tell you this, but one of the things I do is I talk a little bit about this as it comes to top conversations as it relates to religion. She goes, oh my gosh, tell me about it. And right away I picked up in her voice that she had had some bad experiences with spiritual conversations. And I said, well, I would love to hear more about that. And she began to tell me that she was Jewish and she grew up in a neighborhood, all Jewish neighborhood, and they were the poorest Jews in the neighborhood. And so they were always made fun of. And she grew up, her religion was just something that left the worst taste in her mouth. And so she chucked it and said, I want nothing to do with religion. Now, most Christians, when they hear that, are like, wow, we aren't going to go anywhere here today, because she's already said she hates religion. And that's what she said. I hate it. She'd been hurt by it. I got it.
So what'd you do?
I said, well, I'm curious. I said, as you've traveled the world, have you ever met, this was my wondering question, and I often believe that we're one good wondering question away from a significant spiritual conversation. And I said, well, I'm curious. I said, have you ever met anyone or experienced anything in all your travels? And I'm not talking about religion here, but have you ever met anyone or experienced anything that made God seem more real to you? Now that's a question that when we ask it, it helps us key into where somebody might be at or what God's already been up to in their life. And she goes, I have. And I said, would you mind sharing that with me? I'd love to hear that. She said, when I was 12 years old, I was ready to take my life and commit suicide. Like immediately, she had totally pulled me into her story. I said, what was going on? She said, well, my mom and dad were going through a divorce, and they were both pulling at me from both sides, trying to get me to take their side. And as a 12-year-old girl, I thought, if this is as good as life is going to get, I just want to end my life now. And so she put a plan together. She was going to take some of her mom's prescription pills and overdose. So as she described it, she went out to a very remote place where no cars, no houses. It sounded like some kind of out there kind of park where she was set apart. She decided she'd write a note to her parents and tell them why she did what she did. As she told the story, she said, all of a sudden, some lady appeared out of nowhere. She said, I don't know how she got there. I'd never seen her before. I just don't even know where she came from. But she stepped into my life and said, you don't want to do this. Your life is going to bring joy to lots of people. And then she caught herself because she realized in one sense, she had disrobed in front of this guy that she just met on an airplane at 35,000 feet. And she's like, I can't believe I just told you this.
Yeah.
But keep this in mind. When you create God space, people feel safe to poke their spiritual heads out of their shell and disclose, because I believe everybody is hardwired for spiritual conversations. In the same way birds were hardwired to fly south in the winter, people are created in God's image. Therefore, we should have a positive mindset that we should think that people all want to have spiritual conversations if we create a space safe enough for them to do that. She stops and looks at me and she says, I'm sorry. I hardly ever tell anybody this story. You probably think I'm pretty stupid. I said, no, I don't think you're stupid at all. She goes, you don't? I said, no. I said, you'd have to understand something about me. I said, I believe there's a God who created us. And I believe his heart was broken when you, as a 12-year-old, were going to take your life. And in your own words, you said you didn't know where this lady came from. And I just raised the possibility. Is it possible that God sent you an angel? And she goes, oh my gosh, I never thought about it that way
Are
before.
you serious?
And I said, well, have you had any other experiences like this? And she went on to share another experience when she was 20, where a similar kind of thing happened that she had no explanation for. And I looked at her, and you have to, I don't, the stories, in terms of context, I'll give you so much more, but just to say this, she's a lead singer in the band. She's an extrovert. She's lit on both ends. I mean, she's really a fun person. So I just thought in the moment, I'm going to step into this moment. And I felt like the Holy Spirit gave me this boldness to say this. I said, you really are a believer. And she just like went, what? A believer? I told you I hate religion. I said, I get that. I said, but you've just sat here for the last 15 minutes and told me 2 stories that you've admitted that there's a possibility that God showed up in both those stories. And I think you really do believe there's something bigger than yourself. It's just that you don't want to become religious because to you were hurt by religion. But I think deep down in your heart, you're a believer. And she goes, oh my gosh, you're getting me to rethink my whole life. And for the next hour before we hit the tarmac in Edmonton, Canada, I did a Bible study with her on Jesus, who was a friend of sinners, who was non-religious. And that's all we did, was kept our focus on Jesus. And I said, I think you're going to like Jesus because, you said you hated religion. Well, Jesus was always getting in trouble with people who were into religion. I said, I think you're going to like Jesus. I mean, I know you didn't grow up as a Jew, study much about him, but so the next hour we studied the life of Jesus.
Wow. Doug, I mean, that is a cool story. It's encouraging to hear. And, sometimes when I hear a story like that, or I have conversations with people, I will sometimes, and I could see this happening to me in a similar situation, in a conversation like that. This lady, I mean, as you shared that story, I caught myself thinking, I have no idea what I would do with that, or I have no idea what I would say, or I get away from a conversation that, seemed to maybe getting some traction or something. And I think, gosh, I should have said that.
Yeah.
I mean, you're like a pro at this. Does that ever happen to you? Or what would you suggest somebody like me do in a situation like that?
Yeah. Well, here's the beauty of wondering. Actually, I think this is in the book, but I failed my way. I discovered wondering through a failure, like you're talking about, where I felt like I missed the opportunity. As I began to talk to God about that, he birthed this idea in my mind of how I could wonder back into a conversation. There's no statute of limitations for wondering. You can wonder a week later, a month later, a year later. And it's very, very intriguing to somebody and in fact, I would suggest that for most people, it'd be wiser not to try and, if you would, jump into a conversation without wisdom, because we're told to be wise towards outsiders, that maybe it is best for us to exercise self-control in the moment, especially if we know we're going to see them again, and go away from the conversation and begin to get in touch with what we are wondering. Because we can always come back a week later and say, hey, last week over coffee, you said something and I've still been thinking about. And that really, if that's authentic, you've really been doing that, people are just like taking in, like, you're thinking about something I said a week ago. What was that? Well, remember you said this. And when you said that, I've been wondering all week. Now I ask my wondering question. and boom,
Okay.
I'm right into it. So wondering allows us to reclaim missed opportunities.
Yeah, that's helpful, and that's I think that's encouraging, and I really like what you said. There's no statute of limitations on a wondering question. You shared that story, and you talked about how, I mean, the way it progressed, and you spent the last hour like in a Bible study, and so in the midst of where U.S. culture is today, postmodernism and diminished biblical literacy, and even within the church. How do you use the Bible? When do you use the Bible? What, or do you, especially in sort of a postmodern conversation?
Yeah. Well, I think, uh, you know, the Holy Spirit will give us wisdom in the moment in terms of, I love First Peter. It gives us this idea in First Peter 3:15 that we are supposed to be ready to give an answer for the hope that is within us. But then it adds a phrase that I must have cut out of my Bible for at least 12 years in ministry, because it says, to anyone who asks us. And so in my mind, if somebody's not asking, I'm not telling. Not that I don't want to tell, but at the same time, I believe that if I oversupply, I will kill the demand. If I give somebody an answer to a question they weren't asking, they begin to picture me as one of those kind of Christians. So if I'm kind of like right out there on the edge and I'm not sure, this is what I would say. This will never, ever fail you. Always, always, always ask for permission. So, in fact, I did that with her. I said, I know you grew up Jewish, but, would you be willing? We got some time here on the airplane. Would you be willing to take just a little look at Jesus, who is, I think you're going to find the most non-religious guy you'll ever study about? And she was like, sure. So I asked her, and if she had said, no, I'm not interested, I would have said, okay. I mean, you can't make somebody want to sign up for that. But I think in most of our conversations, what I look for is I try to find how, after I hear somebody's story and I've listened to them, I've asked some wondering questions, what it would sound like for me if I'm going to introduce the Bible is something like this. Hey, as I've been listening to you today, and we've been talking about the financial struggles that you're going through and the debt that you've accrued and how you just feel like you're so stressed and anxious. Could I share, a lot of people don't know this, but the number one topic in the Bible is money. That the Bible has more to say about money than any other topic. Could I share just one or two passages with you that I think you might find helpful? So now what I'm doing is I am introducing the topic from God's Word as it relates to
what you've been talking about.
Yeah, the conversation we've been having. And so the beauty of that is, and I think this is where we've missed it. If I could be candid for a moment.
Please.
I think what we are doing, and the reason why so many people are leaving the church today, is because we're talking to the back of people's necks. We're not actually listening to them enough to clue into what part of God's story might connect with them where they're at in their journey. What we are doing is we're giving them this pre-digested curriculum that we've decided in our infinite wisdom that would be best for people. And a lot of times we're missing people. And people are just going, that's irrelevant. I don't see any use for that in my own life.
Yeah.
And, I think that's where we've really missed it. And so when we're doing what I'm talking about here, when we've listened well, we wondered well, and then we ask for permission, I don't think we can go wrong.
Yeah, and I agree. I have found that really helpful, and people who've been around MSN know one of the phrases that we sort of use to introduce that that type of thing, and in terms of asking for permission. And I found the phrase, the introductory phrase, would it be helpful to you if I share something from the Bible, or would it be helpful to you if we talk something about that? But that phrase, I think, just sort of helps put the agenda and the focus back on that individual.
Yeah.
And the whole time, you know, you're coming in and you're asking exactly what you're talking about in terms of asking for permission before you go there. You also, you referred in this particular story, you talked about, you picked up that this lady had maybe had a negative experience with people who were trying to, you know, evangelize her or convert her or share their perspective with her. Other times, you know, we come in contact with, or we intersect the life of somebody who's been like deeply, significantly, profoundly hurt by the Christian community or the church or something like that. Anything we can do, or you would suggest in a situation like that, or in a conversation when that comes up?
Now we're back to just how important it is to listen. And I had a real defining conversation in Colorado. I was flying out there to speak at one of the largest churches out there, and on my way to get my rental car, a young man was in the bus with me on the way over, the shuttle bus, and we struck up a conversation, found out that he was a student coming back, a grad student coming back from studying overseas and coming home for the holidays. We got to the rental car company. I overheard his conversation, and it wasn't going too well for him because while he was out of the country, his driver's license had expired.
Wow.
And they were not going to give him a rental car. And so I'm like, I felt like this was a God moment. Hey, they're giving me a rental car. I've got a car. This guy's in need. How might I step into this moment, offer him a ride, and just see, you know, if this might be a divine appointment? I did so, and he immediately gets in the car. He says, "What do you do for a living?"
What did you say?
When you're the evangelism trainer for Athletes in Action, that title doesn't get you invited to a lot of parties.
Oh, really?
No. So, you know, if we're going to be wise towards outsiders, you know, be careful what card we might lead with. And I said, well, I'm an author and speaker. Just let it at that. He says, what kind of books do you write?
Okay, you're marked.
I said, you could actually help me do what I do better. And he said, what do you mean by that? He was very intrigued. I said, well, I'm actually on my way right now down to Colorado Springs to speak to one of the largest churches in your state, 7,500 people. If I brought you along and I gave you 20 minutes of my time to tell all the people there what not to do to have a spiritual conversation with you, what would you tell them? Well, never forget what he had to say.
What did he say?
He said, the first thing I'd tell him, and he didn't wasted no time. It was obvious that he'd had lots of conversations with Christians. He said, the first thing I'd tell him is, hey, if you're not going to listen to me, I'm not going to listen to you. He goes, I don't know where Christians get off. Every time I talk to a Christian, they want to do all the talking. And he goes, you know what they don't get? I said, no, what don't they get? He said, the whole time they're talking, I've already made up my mind. I don't want what you have because I don't want to become rude and disrespectful like you. And I was like, wow.
Wow.
And I said, it sounds like you have had a plethora of conversations with Christians that have been anything but helpful or fruitful. And he goes, oh, yeah. He goes, where do Christians get off? He goes, it's like every time they're in the conversation, it's not a conversation. It's a monologue. It's not a dialogue. And so I flipped it on him. I said, well, I'm wondering. I said, have you ever had a positive conversation with a Christian? And if so, what made that different? He said, I've only ever had one. I said, tell me about that. He said, well, there was this one guy one time. And basically what he said is, the guy listened to me and he asked meaningful questions that demonstrated that he listened well. And basically what this guy had been telling me is that he's turned off on Christianity, if you want to say hurt by church or hurt by people from church, because at the end of the day, Christians were doing all the talking and they weren't doing any listening. And the whole way down to Denver, or the whole way into Denver, I listened to him. And eventually the boomerang happened where he wanted to hear my God story, because now he felt like I was saved because I had been listening to him. And when he goes to get out of the car, I let him out at the Rockies Stadium there down in town, Denver. He said, I want to tell you something, man. He goes, this is the best spiritual conversation I've ever had. He goes, I wish more people could have conversations like this. Could I have your card? And I was like, that's one of the, I think, signs of whether or not you've created some God spaces. People say, I enjoyed this, and like, I'd like to do it again sometime.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when people are hurt, the best thing we can do is validate their feelings by listening. And even sometimes I'll step into the moment and say, please, please, please don't hold Jesus responsible for something that some of his followers got wrong. This does not reflect who Jesus is. It just reflects that some of his followers, maybe in their zeal or passion, just so a lot of times when you apologize like that, it opens their spirit back up to say, okay, maybe there is something to this after all.
Yeah. So you can apologize for what they've endured or experienced.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet you're not like, if you're in some conversation that brings up some type of different, even viewpoint that's opposite of what the Bible teaches, or a lifestyle that's opposite, in that apology, we're not necessarily condoning.
No, I think a lot of us really get tripped up, Bob, and this is really, I really vacillate about writing a book on this topic, but I think there are two words that we often confuse, and that's acceptance and endorsement.
Mm-hmm.
And when we confuse those two words, we end up in some really pretty crazy places. And this is why a lot of people get hurt. And I think in the story in John there, where Jesus encounters the woman who committed adultery and, offers her radical acceptance, and steps in graciously to spare her life when they were ready to stone her. But yet as she leaves, he makes it clear that he didn't endorse her lifestyle. And I think that's a tension-filled, messy, kind of tough place for us to be, but that's on the cutting edge of mission. We need to learn how to offer radical acceptance, but not endorsement.
Yeah. Earlier you shared the story, and it was 4 years ago, election time, similar to sort of where we are right now. And people talk about this, they write about it, about the divisions that exist in our country today. And those divisions show up politically, they show up with moral issues, they show up racially, they show up with lifestyles, philosophy, all that type of stuff. This isn't original, but people talk about that they've never seen, I don't think I've seen our country divided in the way it is right now in my lifetime.
Yeah.
What opportunities does that create for God space, do you think? How can we go about maybe facilitating that in the conversations, especially if we find ourselves, sitting across the coffee shop from somebody who's opposite from where we are?
Yeah. Well, I love that question, because that's where we find ourselves, right? I mean, that's reality. That's where the rubber meets the road today. Now, I often like to say, when there's a heated conversation, it usually means, and people are polarized, it means that both people possess some light or possess something that represents a core value. And I think the problem is when we move into those kind of conversations, a lot of people feel like they have to get their point across. They have to lob their truth grenades at the other person and hope they can blow them up and show them that they're wrong and that they are right. And I tell people all the time, please, as a Christian, you need to understand something. You never argue anybody into a new way of thinking. What if instead you would seek to understand their position and understand their journey and why their value, whatever is being expressed? Because behind that is a worldview. And if someone's going to leave the place they're in and move to a new place, a lot of times, the only way that's ever going to happen is when we meet them where they presently are, and instead of yelling at them in so many forms or ways, hey, I'm right and you are wrong, all that does is create what we see in our culture today. An us versus them standoff. Neither side is listening. We're just shouting at each other. But what if?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially what we see modeled on TV.
Yeah.
Or in the media.
Showed up instead with convicted civility and instead put the spotlight and the focus on somebody and didn't feel a need to have to try and whip them into shape in one conversation, but instead like started to probe and discover, hey, tell me why that's important to you. Tell me why that makes you pound the table. Tell me why, for you, that's a deal breaker or that represents one of your core values. Has that always been true of you? Can you look back in your life and identify maybe a tipping point where that became really huge to you? Because behind every strong belief or worldview is a journey and someone's story.
Yeah.
And if we can discover that, many times that's where the rich conversation happens. But we want to spend all our time just going at this. This just doesn't get us anywhere.
Wow. Yeah. And as you unpack that, it sort of reminds me, I think of something you said in your book, or maybe when I heard you speak, and you use the phrase sort of like meeting them where they are. And I seem to remember something about you talking about not only meeting them where they are, but accepting them for where they are, not for where we want them to be.
Yes, that's very well said. Absolutely. And I think that's what Jesus did, right? I mean, like, think about this. Okay, let's just step back. And Jesus is invited to Matthew's party. Matthew, the tax collector. He's got prostitutes. He's got drunkards and gluttons there. I mean, there are people that lie there. I mean, Jesus could have went in to that party and closed it down in 5 minutes. He could have said to the drunkards, hey, you over there in the corner, you're drinking too much. You're abusing your body with alcohol. You over there, you're looking at women in this room tonight with lust in your eyes. Haven't you read the scripture that said that's like adultery? You're breaking one of the commandments. I mean, it seemed like Jesus was okay with accepting people for where they were, because I think he knew what we all need to remind ourselves is that until you get to the root, you never change the fruit. And so if you're going to get to the root, until someone's rooted and grounded in Jesus, don't expect the fruit to change. And I think this is where I scratch my head sometimes and goes, are Christians reading their Bible? Don't we understand that you can't expect generate behavior out of unregenerated people? And so why would I spend my time arguing about a position that somebody has when they're not in Christ and their scales are still in their eyes, they're blind, they can't see? Why would I want to try to argue them into a new way of thinking? Because until they have a big aha moment, that's probably not going to change. And I look back at my own life, when Jesus became resident and president in my life, all of a sudden I flip-flopped on a whole bunch of topics because now the Holy Spirit was bringing illumination, and the eyes of my heart were seeing the world differently. And until we get, that straight and get to the root, the fruit, to go out in a crowbar and go after all the bad fruit out there and just want to hammer at it, it just doesn't work in the best interest of advancing the kingdom. That's what I found.
Yeah, it strikes me, Doug, as you sort of talk about that and share some of your stories, especially the one about, how much we're divided in our country. I sense from you very much you're incorporating those wondering questions, but then there's a genuine and authentic interest and desire to understand that person better and understand their journey, and you just sort of set that whole attack agenda aside, and you set aside that I'm gonna unpack all the points to show them where they're wrong. You're really just trying to understand where they've been and how they've gotten to where they are.
Well, I traveled with Josh McDowell. I was trained in apologetics, and I love spiritual cage fights. I mean, back in the day, throw me in the ring with an atheist, throw me in the ring with a Mormon, the JW, whoever you want. And I'm like, okay, you want to get in a ring? I'm going to show you before this conversation is over that you're wrong and I'm right, because it was all about winning. And a lot of times I'd walk away from this conversation feel like I'd won the fight, but
Never see them again.
They weren't listening to me because they were defending their position the whole time. And I wasn't really listening to them because I was just preparing my next argument like a good lawyer. And I never argued anybody into the kingdom.
Wow.
So
Never.
Part of my recovery as an evangelist is realized, oh my gosh, why would I want to continue now don't hear me say that I'm anti-apologetics. No, I think when people have serious questions, we need to provide an answer for the hope that is within us. But I think sometimes maybe people might be a little bit like me. I grew up in a family. I was the oldest in my family. Nobody in my family listened. We just argued at the table, argued for who was right and who was wrong. So when I became a Christian, I was now convinced that I was really right. And so now when it came to conversations, I mean, I had the crowbar in my hand. The Bible says. And so I felt like in every conversation, nobody had a chance to win because I had the ultimate corner on the truth market.
Yeah.
So in a very real sense, I think, and Dallas Willard once said this, it's very difficult when you become right about something to not hurt people with it.
Yeah.
And I maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think, for those who've done so much work in terms of the professions, the people that you're working with, it's easy to feel like I've arrived, I've got the answer, and we're always ready to supply that. And many times the answer might not necessarily be the answer in terms of connecting with a person. We got to start where they are, not where we'd like them to be.
Yeah. Last question, Doug.
Okay.
Let's see. A lot of let's move a little bit further down the road.
Okay.
Let's suppose you've had these conversations, these wondering conversations, these interactions, and the person is fully engaged and enjoying the interaction, and trust is building, and maybe interest is rising. Are there some quick ways that we can maybe sort of make an assessment to sort of get some idea, hey, maybe this person is really moving towards wanting to enter into a relationship with God through the person of Jesus Christ?
Well, I think in some ways we always have to be careful Let me say this, and you can chew on it. It'll take some time to chew on it. Evangelism should be our ultimate motive, not necessarily our ulterior motive. And I think when someone senses that they become your spiritual project, or they feel like you have a bullseye on your back, or they're part of your target audience, language like that. Nobody wants to be thought of in that way. So if I'm going to respect the dignity and, a person's ability to ask questions and and if I'm building trust, I find that when someone is moving towards spiritual birth, when the fruit is ripe, it will just fall off the tree. You don't have to you don't have to get ahead of the process. In the medical world, maybe we could use this language. It's kind of like becoming a spiritual midwife. And if you're a good midwife, I don't think you'd be doing things like, well, I'm going on vacation next week, so let's have the baby now. That's just not what you do as a midwife. You're there to assist in the process of the physical birth. In the same way, it's a very delicate balance of us not feeling like it's on us to make this happen, because if God is at work, he wants it to happen more than we do. And I think our if you want to say our job is to keep in step with the Spirit, not get behind what the Spirit is doing, but also not get ahead of what the Spirit is doing. And one of the ways that I might, do something like that is we've been having conversations. The person trusts me, and we've been kicking around a whole bunch of stuff. And I might say something like this: "Hey, Larry, I so enjoy getting it together, and these conversations we have are always so meaningful to me. I just wonder, as you've been kicking this stuff around, when it gets right down to it, what might be holding you back from making this commitment we talked about in terms of a decision for Christ?" And that's a question that when I feel is appropriate, I would ask that question. And Larry would probably, because I've respected him, he would respectfully respond, and we could continue to have that conversation. Because people, when they're moving towards making a very important decision, they are always going to have questions. I mean, I often say in my workshops, I've never met a girl yet who was at a party one night and some guy shows up at the party and immediately says, "Hey, you look a lot like my first wife. And I'm not married yet." And then gets down on one knee and says, "Will you marry me?" Now, maybe if a girl was completely inebriated, I don't know, but I've never heard a real story of someone proposing the first night they met, because making a decision about marriage is a huge deal. Talking about spending the rest of your life. But sometimes when it comes to evangelism, we don't carry that common sense over. I mean, when you say "I do" to Jesus, we're the bride, he's the groom, as the analogy in the Bible. Why do we want to have shotgun weddings? I mean, I've been a part of those, and to be honest, I've seen a lot of pseudo decisions for Jesus Christ that never, if you want to say, took. And I think they never took because I wasn't sensitive to the process. And in the same way, we would consider any doctor, we would go after his license if he, after 6 months, he said, "I'm just feeling like you need to have that baby today." Well, unless he had good medical reasons for that delivery, any doc who was continuing to do stuff like that with women, is like, stay away from that guy. He wanted to have the baby at 6 months. Well, he didn't let that woman carry the birth to completion. Why? But often it seems like we ignore the process.
Yeah. Well, The book is entitled God Space, Where Spiritual Conversations Occur Naturally. Doug also has a really useful website that I've gone to. I think it's godsgps.com. A lot of resources on there that'll assist you in facilitating these types of conversations. But Doug, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining with us. Doug's available to speak at conferences and churches and consultations, etc. So if there's anything he can do to serve you, maybe give him the chance to do that. So Doug, thank you again for being with us.
Hey, great being with you guys tonight.
Yeah, and thanks to Kyle Stelzer, our engineer and producer of this program. And we'll be doing another webinar sometime after the first of the year. So thank you so much, and hope you have a good night.